The smell reached him before the stairs did. Roasting lamb, bitter herbs, the sharp edge of wine not yet poured, and beneath all of it, something older, the stone itself, the limestone bedrock of Jerusalem sweating in the April heat, the way a city holds the warmth of a day long after the sun has gone. He was climbing stairs he had climbed before, stairs carved into the hill south of the Temple Mount, worn smooth by generations of Passover feet, and he was carrying a clay jar of water in a city where men did not carry water, which was the sign they had been told to look for. His name is not recorded. He was a servant, probably, a slave, possibly. He carried water in a city of 1 million Passover pilgrims, and he did not know that the man who had sent him up this hill, the man whose sandals he was not worthy to untie, by the man's own accounting, was about to transform the meal he was preparing into the most observed ritual in human history. The year was 30 A.D., almost certainly. The city was Jerusalem. The hill was the upper city, the wealthy district rising southwest of the temple, where the houses were large and the cisterns were deep, and the upper rooms were real rooms with real furniture, not the cramped sleeping lofts of Galilean villages. The month was Nisan. The day was the 14th. And by sundown, a group of 13 men from the rural north would sit down in that room and eat a meal that would not end for 2,000 years. This is the story of that room. What it actually looked like, what was actually on the table, how the meal actually worked, and what a single Aramaic word, spoken once over broken bread in a room that archaeology has now partially located, changed about everything that happened next, because the version you have in your head is almost certainly wrong. Not wrong in its meaning, wrong in its material reality. And the material reality, it turns out, is what makes the meaning devastating. The room you are picturing, if you grew up in any tradition that celebrates communion, if you have ever seen a painting, if you have ever sat in a church with a print of Leonardo on the wall, is a long rectangular table, men seated in a row on one side, Jesus at the center, Judas slightly apart, everyone illuminated by a window that opens onto a Tuscan afternoon. That image, Leonardo's Cenacolo, painted in Milan in 1495, has colonized the Western imagination so completely that most people cannot picture the Last Supper without it. Leonardo was a genius. He was also painting Milan in the 15th century, not Jerusalem in the 1st, and his room, his table, his chairs, his bread, his light, none of it is accurate. Let me show you what we actually know. The upper city of Jerusalem in the 1st century was the address of the priestly aristocracy, the Herodian elite, the families who had grown wealthy under Roman patronage, and who expressed that wealth in stone. Archaeologists excavating the Jewish quarter of the modern city, work that began seriously after 1967, when Israeli excavations opened the area following the Six-Day War, found the remains of several large private residences from the Herodian-period, the precise era of Jesus. The largest of these, what excavators call the palatial mansion, covered 600 square meters and included a ritual bath, plastered walls with frescoes, and stone vessels of the kind John's Gospel mentions at Cana. These were not modest homes. These were the homes of people who had space to spare, including space on the upper floor. The Greek word the Gospel of Luke uses for the room is anagaion, upper room. The Gospel of Mark uses kataluma, which is sometimes translated as guest room or lodging space, the same word used in Luke's birth narrative, the same word mistranslated as inn, that sent Joseph and Mary into a stable that almost certainly was not a stable. But that is a different video. What matters here is what anagaion tells us. A room on the upper floor of a substantial Jerusalem house, large enough for 13 men to recline, furnished, prepared. The word furnished in the Greek is astromenon, spread, laid out, prepared. The room was already set. Someone owned it. Someone had arranged it. The identity of that owner is not given, but the detail that a man carrying a water jar was the sign, a detail so specific and so odd that it reads like a prearranged signal, suggests prior arrangement, a homeowner who was a follower, a room held in readiness for exactly this night. Picture the room. Not Leonardo's room, the real one. The floor was stone, almost certainly, or packed earth covered with rushes. The walls were plastered, likely white or pale yellow, the lime plaster that archaeologists find throughout the upper city residences. There were oil lamps, small clay lamps with a single wick floating in olive oil, producing more smoke than light, filling the upper corners of the room with a thin haze that smelled of burning fat. The ceiling was low by modern standards, perhaps 3 meters, supported by wooden beams. There were no windows in the way we imagine windows. There were narrow openings, perhaps covered with wooden shutters, letting in the night air and the sound of a city with 1 million people in it, all of them celebrating the same feast. The table was not a table. This is the first thing that changes everything. First-century Jewish dining, particularly for a formal meal, and Passover was the most formal meal of the Jewish year, followed the Greco-Roman triclinium arrangement. The word triclinium means 3 couches, and the arrangement was precisely that. 3 low couches arranged in a U-shape around a central low table, with diners reclining on their left sides, propped on their left elbows, leaving their right hands free to eat. You did not sit upright at a Passover meal in first-century Jerusalem if you were following the tradition. You reclined. The reclining was not incidental. It was theological. The Mishnah, the rabbinic legal code compiled around 200 AD, but preserving traditions centuries older, states explicitly, even the poorest person in Israel must recline at the Passover meal, because reclining is the posture of free people, and Passover is the celebration of freedom from Egyptian slavery. You reclined to remember that you were no longer a slave. This detail, that they were reclining, not sitting, solves a puzzle that has confused readers for centuries. The Gospel of John records that the beloved disciple was reclining next to Jesus, literally in his bosom, close enough that Peter had to signal him across the table to ask Jesus a question. In a modern table arrangement, this proximity is strange. In a triclinium arrangement, it is simply the mechanics of the reclining position. The person to your right reclines with their head near your chest, their body extending away from you to the right. The beloved disciple was reclining in the position of honor to Jesus' right, head near Jesus' chest, which is why he could whisper and why Peter could not simply lean over and ask the question himself. And Judas. The Gospel of John records that Jesus dipped a piece of bread and handed it to Judas, a gesture that required physical proximity. In the triclinium arrangement, the host controlled the seat of honor to his left, the position of greatest trust. Some scholars have argued that Judas occupied this seat, the seat to Jesus' left, the seat a host would give to his most honored guest, the seat close enough for bread to be passed hand to hand. If this is correct, and the textual evidence is suggestive, then Jesus placed his betrayer in the seat of greatest honor. He gave him the seat reserved for the most beloved. Let that land for a moment. The food on the table was specific, and it was specific by law. The Passover Seder of the first century was not identical to the modern Seder. The Haggadah, the formal liturgical text that structures the modern meal, was compiled over centuries after the temple's destruction in 70 AD. But its core elements were ancient and prescribed. The Mishnah tractate Pesachim Passover, describes what must be on the table. The lamb, roasted whole over fire, because the original Passover instructions in Exodus specified roasting and not boiling. The bitter herbs, maror, almost certainly wild lettuce or endive in the 1st century, bitter enough to make the eyes water, eaten to remember the bitterness of slavery. The charosette, a paste of fruit and nuts and wine that represented the mortar the slaves had made. The unleavened bread, matzah, flat and cracker-like, because there had been no time for bread to rise on the night of the Exodus. And the wine, 4 cups of it, each cup corresponding to one of the 4 divine promises in Exodus 6. I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my people. The lamb had been slaughtered that afternoon. This is the detail that places everything in context. On the 14th of Nisan, in the hours between noon and sundown, every family in Jerusalem brought their Passover lamb to the Temple Mount, and the priests slaughtered it. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records that in a single Passover he witnessed, 256,500 lambs were slaughtered in the temple courts. Scholars debate the precise number, but the scale is not disputed. The temple courts ran with blood on Passover afternoon, the Levitical choir sang the Hallel psalms continuously, and the smoke of 10,000 fires rose from the city as families roasted their lambs for the evening meal. The smell of that afternoon would have been overwhelming. Blood and smoke and incense, and the unwashed bodies of 1,000,000 pilgrims pressed into a city built for perhaps 80,000 permanent residents. Jesus had walked through that afternoon. He had been in the temple courts that week, teaching in the porticos, debating the Pharisees and Sadducees, watching a widow drop 2 coins into the treasury. He had seen the lambs. He had smelled the blood. And now, in this upper room, with the smell of roasting lamb drifting through the narrow window openings, he reclined at the center of the U-shaped arrangement and began the meal that every Jewish family in Jerusalem was beginning simultaneously, the meal his people had been eating for 13 centuries, the meal that began with a child asking, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" The Passover meal moved through a liturgical structure. The first cup of wine was poured and blessed. The bitter herbs were dipped in salt water representing the tears of slavery, and eaten. The story of the Exodus was told, the Maggid, the telling, because the commandment in Exodus is not to remember the Exodus, but to tell it, to narrate it, to make it present. The second cup was poured. The Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113 and 114, were sung. Then the meal itself, the lamb, the bread, the bitter herbs, the carousel. And then, somewhere in the sequence of the meal, the Gospels do not agree on the precise moment, which is itself a kind of honesty. Jesus took the bread. The bread was matzah, flat, unleavened, cracker-like. Not the round loaf of a modern communion service, not the wafer of a Catholic Mass, not anything that resembles what most people visualize when they visualize this moment. It was the bread of affliction, the bread of haste, the bread that remembered slavery. And Jesus took it, and he said the blessing over it, the blessing that every Jewish father said at every Passover meal, the blessing his father Joseph had said, the blessing he had heard from childhood. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech ha'olam hamotzi, lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And then he broke it, and he said something that was not part of the liturgy. The Aramaic word that Matthew and Mark record is guf, body. This is my body. But the word that would have landed in that room, the word that every man reclining on those couches would have heard in its full weight, was not simply a word for a physical body. In Aramaic, guf carried the sense of the self, the whole person, the essential being. He was not saying, "This bread represents my flesh." He was saying, "This bread is me. This is what I am. This is the whole of what I am, broken and given, the bread of affliction, the bread of slavery, the bread of the people who had been ground down and brought through, taken, blessed, broken, given." He did the same with the cup. The third cup, almost certainly, the cup of redemption, the cup that corresponded to the divine promise, "I will redeem you." He took it, and he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many." The Greek word in Matthew is diathēkē, covenant, the same word the Septuagint uses to translate the Hebrew Brit, the binding agreement between God and Israel sealed in blood at Sinai, the covenant Moses ratified by throwing blood on the people and saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you." Jesus was not inventing a new metaphor. He was fulfilling an old one. He was saying, "The covenant that began in blood at Sinai, the covenant your fathers sealed with the blood of lambs, is being fulfilled tonight, in this cup, in this room." The men in that room were not theologians processing an abstract doctrine. They were Jews who knew their scriptures, who had grown up hearing the Torah read every Sabbath, who knew what covenant blood meant, who knew what the lamb meant, who knew what the bread of affliction meant. And they were sitting in a room that smelled of roasting lamb, in a city whose temple courts had run with blood that afternoon, and the man they had followed for 3 years was telling them that he was the bread, and he was the cup, and he was the lamb. They did not fully understand it. The Gospels are honest about this. Understanding came later, after the events that followed had reframed everything that had preceded them. But they heard it. The words landed in that room, in that smell, in that light, in that posture of freedom, and they could not be unheard. There is a detail in John's account that most readers pass over. After the meal, after the bread and the cup, and the extended discourse that John records across 4 chapters, Jesus and the 11 remaining disciples, Judas had left by then, into the night, John notes simply that it was night, sang a hymn, and went out. The hymn they sang was almost certainly the second half of the Hallel. Psalms 115 through 118, the psalms that concluded the Passover meal. Every Jewish family in Jerusalem sang these psalms at the end of the Seder. The hills of Jerusalem would have been filled with the sound of them, thousands of voices in the April night singing the ancient words. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Jesus sang that line. He sang it knowing what was waiting at the bottom of the hill, in the garden where the olive press stood, in the place whose Aramaic name was Gethsemane, which means exactly that, the oil press, the place of crushing. He sang it anyway. The room they left behind was not abandoned. The Gospel of Acts records that after the resurrection, the disciples returned to the upper room, the same room, most scholars believe, and waited there, 120 of them eventually, until the day of Pentecost. The room became the first gathering place of what would become the church. And the meal they had eaten in it, the bread and the cup, taken in memory, spread from that room to every corner of the Roman world within a generation, carried by people who had not been there, who had not smelled the lamb or heard the singing, but who had been told, "Do this in remembrance of me." The site of that room is contested, as almost everything in Jerusalem is contested. The traditional location, preserved in Christian tradition since at least the 4th century, is on Mount Zion, the hill southwest of the Temple Mount, in a Crusader-era building that sits above earlier Byzantine foundations, that sit above earlier Roman period remains. The room shown to tourists today, a Gothic hall with ribbed vaulting, built by the Crusaders in the 12th century, is not the room. It cannot be. But beneath it, the archaeological layers descend, and the location, the upper city, the wealthy district, the hill with the large houses and the deep cisterns, is consistent with everything the Gospels describe. The room itself is gone, but what happened in it is not. Here is what the archaeology and the texts together give us, stripped of Leonardo, and centuries of artistic overlay. 13 men from rural Galilee, most of them laborers, reclining in the posture of free men in a borrowed room in the wealthiest district of Jerusalem, in a city swollen to 10 times its normal population, for a feast celebrating liberation from slavery, eating the meal their ancestors had eaten for 13 centuries, and hearing the man at the center of their U-shaped arrangement say that the bread they were eating was him, that the cup they were drinking was the new covenant in his blood, and that they should keep doing this, keep breaking this bread and drinking this cup, until he came back. The word he used for remembrance, the word in Luke's account, is the Greek anamnesis. It does not mean simply to recall something past, the way you might remember a birthday. Anamnesis in the Greek world and in Jewish liturgical tradition meant to make present again, to reactualize, to bring the past event into the present moment, so that it is not merely remembered, but participated in. The Passover Maggid uses the same concept. You do not tell the story of the Exodus as history. You tell it as your story. The Mishnah says, "In every generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally left Egypt, not their ancestors. Them. Do this in my anamnesis. Do this and make me present again. Do this, and you are not remembering a meal that happened once in a room in Jerusalem. You are at the table, you are reclining, the bread is in your hands, and the man who took it and blessed it and broke it and gave it is giving it to you. The room is gone. The lamb is gone. The oil lamps have been dark for 2,000 years. The man who carried the water jar up the stairs is not recorded, will not be recorded, exists only in that single detail. Carrying water in a city where men did not carry water, a sign in a city full of signs, a servant making a room ready for a meal that would not end. But the bread is still being broken. In 10,000 languages, on every continent, in cathedrals and mud-walled churches and living rooms and hospital chapels, the words are still being said, "This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." And by the logic of anamnesis, by the logic of the tradition Jesus was standing inside when he said it, the saying is not a memorial. It is a presence, the stone the builders rejected, marvelous in our eyes. If you have ever taken communion and felt like you were going through a motion, like you were performing a ritual whose original force had faded into familiarity, this is what you were holding. Not a symbol invented by a church council. A meal eaten in a real room, on a real night, by real men who smelled the lamb and heard the singing, and did not yet know what the next 12 hours would cost, in a city whose temple courts had run with blood that afternoon, by a man who knew exactly what was waiting at the bottom of the hill, and who broke the bread anyway, who poured the cup anyway, who sang the psalm anyway. This is my body, broken for you. He meant it materially. He meant it completely. He meant it for the men in that room, and for everyone who would ever sit at a table and repeat the words, which means he meant it for you. What would it change, this week, if you took that seriously? Not as doctrine to affirm, but as presence to receive? The bread in your hands is not a symbol of something absent. By the logic of the tradition, it is the thing itself, given again, broken again for you. If this video gave you something, if the room feels more real to you now, if the meal lands differently, share it with someone who needs to sit at that table. And if you want to keep going deeper into the world that Jesus actually inhabited, the archaeology, the language, the material reality beneath the familiar stories, subscribe. There is more room to explore. There is always more room.